Hey, Dickheads! We have a special pink laser beam of truth coming to you from across the globe and in quarantine. Evan Lampe, who is returning for his third appearance on the podcast, live from China for us, not for you. For us, he's live from China. And now let's get into, we're going to do the next 5 books in the Philip K. Dick hoorah, starting with Martian Time Slip, which I think Evan and I both agree is one of Philip K. Dick's favorites. Your first general thoughts on Martian Time Slip,
Evan? I think this whole period is just wild. I think that 63, 64 to 66, those books he published, they're my favorite by far. So all of these I love. But and they all deal with like distinct themes. They overlap a little bit, but they're all really, I was just jotting down some of the themes of these different 5 books, and they're all over the place, but they're all like to some of his most interesting ideas. And I think like Martian Time Slip is a great example of that. Now, this is maybe one of the best plotted of these 5, I think, in the sense that it seems a little bit more structured. But I don't know what to say. It's like the Wild West on Mars, but combined with like suburban California degradation.
Now,
it's just kind of mixing up all these things together. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll get more into what it was actually about in a little bit, but let's talk about the actual writing of it. It was written in October of 1962, and that was right after he wrote the first draft of We Can Build You and before Dr. Blood Money. So he wrote this and Dr. Blood Money back to back.
Yeah.
The manuscript reached SMLA in 1962, a month after they received We Can Build You. But it was first serialized as All We Marsmen in the World of Tomorrow. It also had his original title for it. Are you ready for this, Evan? Good Member.
Yeah, right. I don't know.
Yeah, it's Good Member Arnie Knott of Mars. That was Philip K. Dick's chosen title.
Wow. Yeah, Good Member. Time Slip's a little bit better.
Right.
But I like the We Are All Marsmen one too, because you got this diverse, you got these different Martians. You know, you got the settlers, you got the indigenous people, and you got these different classes and the unions. I think it's
Israeli.
Like the kibbutzes and all that. I think it's just an interesting experiment and like frontier. I think this is one of his best frontier novels.
Well, yes, and I think We Are Marsmen is better than Good Member Arnie Knott of Mars, but I'm glad that I think it was Berkeley who eventually published it, chose the name Martian Time Slip, because that is actually, I think, one of my favorite titles, too. It's one that has always resonated with me. I love the title. And it actually has more to do with, well, I guess you're right. We Are Marsmen does have to do with the plot. But anyways, it was sold to Valentine in 1963, and it was rejected by Ace. Don Wollheim turned down Martian Time Slip. And it's because he asked for one very specific change. And he said, Don Wollheim said, and I quote, "It offended my science fiction sense. There couldn't have been a Mars colony in 1994 when he put it. If he had thrown it 100 years in the future, I would have bought it." And for some reason, PKD decided that he refused to change the year, so much so that he went to another publisher. But that ended up working out for him because he got Valentine, I think, gave him a hardcover with this one. But, and then the last thing I'll say about the publication history, and then we'll get more into your ideas on the book, but Dick said a couple of times that he thought this book was that this was closer to his non-sci-fi, his mainstream novels, that he thought this was more of a literary work, on par with, maybe I actually have the quote here. He said, with High Castle and Time Slip, I thought I had bridged the gap between the experimental mainstream novel and science fiction. Suddenly, I found a way to do everything I wanted to do as a writer. I had in mind a whole series of books, a vision, a new kind of science fiction progressing from those two novels. Then Time Slip was rejected by Putnam and every other hardcover publisher we sent it to. Okay, so it wasn't a hardcover. Yeah. It was with Valentine. But then he also said,
That's interesting. He wrote this right next to Dr. Blood Money, which also, I think, is trying to bridge that gap. Like a lot of domestic drama, affairs, like the kind of stuff his mainstream novels are about, right? Suburban living and these couples, with their marriage problems. Clans of the Elfane Moon does the same sort of stuff. I mean, it's basically a divorce, right?
Right. And he was still with Anne at this point. There were 2 more years before I think they divorced. So, which is one of the reasons why. Yeah, we'll see the effect of that when we get to Clans of the Elfane Moon for sure. Yeah, but
well, all these are weird on relationships too. Like,
well, yeah.
Oh yeah. You do a whole episode just on the relationships and the sexual politics of these 5 novels.
Yeah, I think we were joking about calling it our Divorcepedia because we always, whenever we're not sure who he was married to or divorcing at any given time, we always say we have to check Divorcepedia.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's interesting to think of that he thought this was the gap. This was one of the bridge books, and that he saw it on the same level as Man in the High Castle. And so, and I definitely think that during this period, there were books that were of a higher quality level that I think this one kind of goes with. I always think of Time Out of Joint, Man in the High Castle, and March of Time Slip. Personally, I think Eye in the Sky is one of his early best. But I think that these ones do mark a little bit more sophistication. And I think, it's funny because you and I rated March of Time Slip very highly, but the other Dickheads were not as big of fans. But I think this book works on a really solid level. And I do think that it bridges that gap. But then Dick said, my vision collapsed. I was crushed. I had made a miscalculation somewhere, and I don't know how. The evolution I had made of myself, of the marketplace, went poof. I reverted to a more primitive concept of my writing. The books that followed March and Time Slip were gone. So it's interesting to think of the fact that he had this other direction planned in mind than all the other pulpy stuff he ended up writing after this. And it's interesting to kind of think about where he might have gone with that. But I don't know. It's interesting. But anyways, so March and Time Slip, we have lots of issues. I'd say first one of the main things is the whole schizophrenia and autism thing. He was inspired by, he and Dorothy used to have to watch a friend's autistic son, and that inspired that aspect of the story. But what's really interesting about that is that there's kind of the schizophrenia and autism gets kind of blurred in there. What do you think about that aspect of the novel, March of Time Slip?
I think, I'm interested in everything he has to say about any kind of mental disorder or anything, and throughout these works, and we'll get to Clans of the Elfane Moon, I'm sure. I think I read somewhere, or I did some research, that there was like this idea that autism was something about time, was out there in literature at the time. And so he may have pulled it from somewhere, or he just came up with it himself. But I think it's a great idea to build a novel around this idea, right?
Well, as somebody who works, I work with people with autism, and I obviously think it's a little bananas, and it doesn't make any actual sense. But once if I allow myself to just go with what the novel is doing, I enjoyed that aspect of the story, and I like the idea that somebody could have a disorder that leaves them kind of slipping through time is really cool. I just can't think of it as autism, but it's like go ahead.
Well, it's something Dick likes to think about, which is different perceptions, right? So if you got like, what's the novel? The one, Eye in the Sky, right? Where everyone kind of sees the world a little bit differently, right? And, he does that in a lot of his works, of course. So it's...
Right. Yeah, and I think that the autism and schizophrenic vision of this story is so important to what makes Martian Time Slip such a weird book, but is also what makes it interesting and not like. And I think what's really key is that if you look at that, this came out in 1964. This is why people like Don Wollheim and Tony Boucher, who were buying his work, saw him, even though he wasn't a commercial author at that time at all. His books didn't sell, but they kept publishing him because he was breaking new ground and doing interesting things. And I think this book, much like High Castle, just really does new and interesting things that the genre hadn't seen before. So let's talk about the world building here, because I think this is some of Dick's best world building.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and what he's got going on here, he introduces the idea on the very first page that something that he'll come back to with Three Stigmata is the idea that to cope with life on Mars, drugs are being used to make life in the colony more bearable. How do you think this fits into his greater view of the frontier? And I know the frontier is one of your huge issues with Dick, and this has got to be one of his ultimate frontier novels.
Yeah, I think there's at least two phases to his view on the frontier. And I think in his short stories he wrote in the mid-50s, early 50s, he's still got this kind of Promethean attitude towards the frontier. There's going to be kind of a human revival. It's the key to human salvation. Even some of his novels do this, like Jones, the world Jones made, right? Or I think Time Out of Joint, the same thing.
Yeah.
Where the lunatics are somehow the next stage of mankind. And this might be we were just talking about Van Vogt on the other podcast, right? There's this kind of Promethean idea in the air, right? And Dick was breathing that in, right? But I think this is an important novel because he starts to have this vision of this really degraded frontier that's just an extension of the old garbage from the center, right? Mars becomes a center of development, right? And you just get the same kind of ethnic communities. You get the same kind of genocidal ideals. You get the same kind of education systems. Everything's just a crude extension of the homeland. And it just kind of becomes degraded. And I think that's also, like, when Manfred shifts into the future, he's basically in this rotten housing development, right? Years after it's kind of been decayed. So he's seen the outcome of the developers' plans, which is going to be this degraded Mars, which is the way the kind of the Earth suburbs were going in Dick's view, like the California suburbs. So that has it. And then I think Three Stigmata deepens this in a way with really focusing on the drug use and the misery and the boredom of life on the colonies. It's a little bit more brutal. I think Martian Time Slip has a little bit more. There's a little bit more life there. I mean, it's not horrible. It's not as horrible as in Three Stigmata.
So you already touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about the various different cultures that exist on Mars. Besides, we'll get to the racial stereotypes and the Bleakmen later, I think. But of the humans that have colonized on Mars, like, for me, one of the most interesting things was the kibbutz, and that Ben Gurion was, I think the airport, was named after him. No, that may be actually in Israel. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But, there's some really interesting political dynamics at play in the culture that the humans have on Mars. Like, give me your thoughts on that, on what's going on there.
Well, I don't remember all the different communities that were there. I do remember the kibbutzes. Like the labor politics. I think that was an interesting thing, the importance of the labor unions.
And the repair shops.
That the working class seemed to have a little bit more political power on Mars, maybe just because of the realities of being on a frontier. I just remember kind of all these kind of ethnic identities endured. So the frontiers don't become something new. That's one thing I was really struck by. The frontier just becomes an extension of the old.
Okay. So yeah, on page 96, I pulled up this part. Mr. Yee can lease me to the workers' union. I'd be paid by Mr. Yee, and he'd be paid by Arnie. Everyone would be happy, and why not? Tinkering with the broken and malfunctioning mind of a child certainly has more to recommend than tinkering with refrigerators and encoders. So that's an interesting thing about like how the unions work. The water union and how labor works.
And people could buy and sell contracts, right? I remember that.
Yeah, and so I think that's one of the interesting things about like the whole thing that he set up here on Mars is that's one of the reasons why this book has such great world building, is because I think so many things about how Mars functions is very interesting and very different. But
yeah, I mean, of course, the developers, that's just huge here.
And the land speculators.
The schools, robotic schools. I mean, that is great stuff. I loved that part of this. Mm-hmm. The whole robot teachers. This is the one where you have like Mark Twain teaching literature and Cicero teaching political science or whatever. That's this one, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is.
Like, yeah, the historical figures or the literary figures are teaching their respective fields to people. Right.
Yeah, and then there were some. Go ahead.
Oh, what else here?
Well, I think
the genocidal aspect of the novel too. I think it's part of I guess it's part of the world building. I mean, both the Bleakmen, that's maybe the most obvious, but from Earth too. Like they're going to genocide all of anyone with mental health issues, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and the Bleakmen. Okay, I guess we can get into that. There's all kinds of weird racial stereotypes in this book, from how on page 11 there's a line. It says one of the characters says, "Let's see if those rich Jews up in New Israel have a steam bath that wastes water," and and then we set up operations here before the UN was anything, but anything here but a flag painted in the sand. We had houses built before they had a pot to piss in anywhere on Mars, including all that disrupted area in the south between the U.S. and France. So I thought that's an interesting thing about how they're talking about how, they named some of the mountains after Stalin, and there's all kinds of interesting things about, about how the land works there. But, but the Bleakmen, it's just this interesting thing where the Bleakmen set up the situation where Dick is able to comment on colonialism and racism here, and that's certainly like on just as early as page 13, he uses the N-word to like the people on Mars definitely use that word when they're talking about the Bleakmen, and they're seen as just kind of like this kind of population that is just too bad they're here. Like they showed up to Mars and it doesn't matter that they're indigenous or whatever.
Well, I do think this is the story of the West in a way of what U.S. empire in the West, because you got this eradication of the indigenous population, the theft of their land, and then what follows that up is certainly a very diverse population of different white people, which is what you got here, and capital following them up, right? Whether it's the big ranchers or the big mines, here it's the developer. I mean, the real estate developer is the like something about the developers I wanted to say and I thought about was this happens both in Martian Time Slip and Three Stigmata, where you have these people with these amazing powers and abilities. In the Three Stigmata, it's precogs. Here, it's Manfred's ability to essentially experience different points in time, and they both get used for very boring kind of short-term capital improvements, for the purpose of capital, right? People who can see the future, what do you use it for? You use it to predict the next fashion, right? It's so mundane, right? And I think it's such a contrast to the way mutant powers are seen in like the Joseph Campbell stuff, right?
Yeah.
In the 1850s, all this human fetishizing. Even Dick got into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, one last thing I want to say about Martian Time Slip and Mars in this context. We can expand on this. Is a friend of the podcast, James Reich, who last year wrote a novel called "The Song My Enemies Sing," and one of the things he wanted to do was set that book in this kind of fictional Mars and just go ahead and let fly like all the inaccuracies that 50s and 60s sci-fi writers were writing about Mars. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about Martian Time Slip, and where now that I think about it, this might be why Dick wanted to stick to his guns with Wolheim on this, is because we laughed and said, yeah, Wolheim was right. There's no way there'd be a Mars colony in 94. But I don't think Dick cares. I think his version of Mars here is so ridiculous and so experimental, it can't exist in our universe. And I almost think that he's wanting this version of Mars to be this completely surreal place that doesn't really exist in our universe. What do you think about that idea?
Well, ever since you mentioned this, that he held out on the date, I was thinking, why is that? And, because I think often, like, dates this is true in all his works, right? The date really doesn't matter that much, except maybe in, like, Time on a Joint, where you're dealing with someone who had to have lived a certain time period to experience the 50s, right? Usually it doesn't matter, it's just kind of random. A lot of them are in the 90s. He puts a lot of things, but that's close enough, I guess, to people's lives, to their experiences, so they can draw those connections to things that are happening around them and this world he's painting. But I like this idea you're playing with, that it's almost like you put it close enough so it almost does become a bizarre world. Might as well just be an alternate reality. It allows them to be a little bit freer.
Yeah, and I
did really that in the vast future. It's in the distant future. It is more real, believable, I guess.
Right, and this isn't something we talked about on our episode about Time Slip. It's just something that kind of occurred to me now, because when you look at like the idea that there would be like this Israeli settlement and these other things, it's like he's putting real politics in there, but at the same time, he's this concept of how time moves and the fact that there's still canals there. It's like, I think by that time it would be ridiculous. I think even the science proved that there was no way that there could be Bleakmen on Mars, that there could be life on Mars, and he had to have known that. And I think at this point, it's different from like when Edgar Rice Burroughs is writing John Carter of Mars. They really didn't know, or when Wells wrote War of the Worlds. But at this point, 1962, he definitely knew that life wasn't on Mars. So, I'm going to have to rethink what I said before about what Mars means I don't know if it's the same in Three Stigmata, but I think in this one he's definitely looking for more of a surreal landscape in Martian Time Slip. So
yeah,
that almost changes my whole.
It's hard for me not to see here him just trying to tell the story of California. I do think more so than in Three Stigmata. This is the story of California, where you got this frontier that gets colonized and gets turned into just like bland, cookie cutter homes, and you got that diversity of people, and he's actually even the labor issues are interesting, because in the 60s you could make a case that labor was overpowered in the 60s. I mean, that was one reason they had that conservative reaction in the 80s, like, oh, labor, it's a little bit too powerful, so the Reagan argument, right? We got to suppress labor. It was the high point of union power in the U.S. So there's a lot here that seems to be drawn from life, except for the robotic schools. I think there's the robot teachers.
Yeah. I
love that idea. Even as a teacher, I love the idea that a robot will take my job someday and do better at it. So I think even the case is made in that section of the book that robot teachers will do a better job teaching kids, especially kids with handicaps.
No, I think that's funny too. And as somebody who teaches kids with disabilities and kind of feels like a robotic teacher doing it over Zoom now, that there is something to that. That is one of the funniest or interesting moments. I would say that Martian Time Slip is not as comical as some of the other books, although there are definitely still a few laugh out loud parts to this book. But
there's the suicide that's in the very early pages of the novel, Norbert Steiner's suicide. You have the stuff at the end, which is kind of quite nice. It's quite touching. So I think this one is played a little bit straighter, but I think but not the affair. I mean, the traveling salesman seducing the wives. That's hilarious. And another cliche. We talked about ethnic cliches in this novel, but the cliche of the traveling salesperson seducing the wives.
Right. Well, so when and this episode still hasn't come out yet, and it will soon, hopefully. But when we voted on our favorite novels, or ranked our novels for the first 10 years, you had Martian Time Slip as number 2. And the highest, you had Martian Time Slip ranked the highest of our panel of Dickhead experts. So I know that you are quite a fan of this book. And the book ended up higher on the list just because of you and I had it very high, and Brian Evanson had it very high. So the three of us put Martian Time Slip up high. And I will say that I think that thinking about it as a surreal novel does add more to it. And when you listen to those quotes from Dick that he saw it as something bridging the gap between his mainstream novels and that he saw it on a higher level, I think that might be what he was looking for.
Yeah, well, in terms of surrealism, the last third is kind of glorious, right? With when you experience these scenes again and again in a little bit different ways, and they get increasingly bizarre. There's even the one with the teacher kind of transforms, like the robot teacher transforms into something else. That's just great stuff. It's really wonderful. It kind of was like Three Stigmata in that way. People to do that same kind of totally take you out of realism. Right.
All right. Any final thoughts on Martian Time Slip?
Final thoughts. I put this as number 1 on the list. I don't even.
No, you put it as number 2. I think.
I mean, a 2. Yeah, I believe I put it up high. I love this. I think it's just a great novel about the California frontier. I think kind of the use of these abilities for mundane purposes, I think is great. You got the brutality of the technocracy, whether it's the developers and their attitude towards the Bleakmen and the unions on Mars, or just the whole attitude of Earth that, we just need to genocide whoever, is abnormal for the purity of the race. You got this kind of quasi-fascist conversation, which he does in a lot of books at this time. Everything, obviously Man in High Castle, but the Simulacra too. So there's a lot in here, but I think it's one of the best plotted and coherent of the novels from this period.
Yeah, I would agree. Next is the Penultimate Truth. As opposed to the Final Truth, we got the Penultimate Truth. The Penultimate Truth was written in March to May 1964, the final draft. It was published in September of that year, so very quick turnaround. And it was, this draft of Penultimate Truth was written right after Three Stigmata, and written congruently with the Zap Gun, which we're doing next on the podcast as of this recording. And right before the Unteleported Man, which we just finished recording our episode on Lysing / Unteleported Man. And so he had to write an outline for Penultimate Truth and send it to Ace in 1964. So he knew he was going to fix up two short stories. I know we're going to talk about the third one that influences it too. But, the idea was that he was going to take two stories originally, The Defenders and Mold of Yancey, and combine them. That's what he told Ace. And so they wanted a outline from him. So he actually had to write a conceptual outline, which I don't know of him doing any other time. And the two short stories that he spliced together were The Defenders and Molded Yancey. And Defenders was originally published in the 1953 issue of Galaxy. And 1955 is when the appearance of the Mold of Yancey happened. And there's also a third short story which influenced at least one scene in the novel, and that story is, help me out here,
The Unreconstructed M.
The Reconstructed M.
Unreconstructed M.
Yeah. And
that's a wonderful story.
Yes. And I only knew about it because of your episode, and I think you and all the stuff I've seen written about the Penultimate Truth, your podcast was the only one to give that one credit.
What I wanted to say about these three stories is, he uses these three stories, but thematically, the Penultimate Truth is so different from these three stories.
Absolutely.
It uses structure from the Defenders and ideas from the Defenders, but it has none of the same conclusions or ideas as the Defenders. Right? And it's the same with the Mold of Yancey. So the Mold of Yancey, it's about people having their political opinions swayed by this banal, folksy political caricature, right? Like the Eisenhower, I guess, was the model for the Mold of Yancey. And that shifts the population's politics to this banal, I guess, I don't know, centrism or something, kind of towards authoritarianism. And you have Yanceymen here, you have the words, you have this idea of a political elite, but none of the same concepts really at work here. It's much more brutal here. Same thing with the Defenders. The reality is actually so much worse, more worse in the Penultimate Truth than in the Defenders.
But the Defenders on its own is a really strong story, and when I was thinking about Philip K. Dick's Electric Dreams, that was adapting a lot of the short stories from that era, I thought that would make an incredible episode of that show. And as a standalone story, The Defenders is actually, I think, one of his better short stories from that era.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great idea, and it's done really well here. But I actually think in the Penultimate Truth, it's almost better if it's done by the people, not by the robots. Mm-hmm. Because in the Penultimate Truth, the robots aren't in control. They're just slaves. They're just serfs. You being used by these Yanceymen, who I guess they never fully went underground, right? Or were they? Some of them were people that left early. But anyways, and then yeah.
We'll get into the Penultimate Truth plot in a little bit, but I do have a quote from Dick directly talking about these short stories. He said, obviously, Yancey is based on President Eisenhower. During his reign, we were all worrying about the man in the gray flannel suit problem. We feared that the entire country was turning into one person and a whole lot of clones. Although in these days the word clone was unknown, I liked this story mold of Yancey enough to use it as the basis for my novel, The Penultimate Truth. In particular, the part where everything the government tells you is a lie. I still like that part. I mean, I still believe it's so. Watergate, of course, bore the basic idea of the story out. So,
that's his notes to the mold of Yancey, right?
Yes. Yep. And
yeah.
he also said, he also blamed The Penultimate Truth for the reason why the FBI knocked on his door, which is interesting. Yeah. And asked about the FBI in his door, he said, I don't know. Early in the 60s, I did write a novel about a phony war between the United States and Russia that's carried out for the sole purpose of keeping citizens of those countries underground while the leaders lived in palatial splendor above ground. In the novel, some Americans and some Russians are able to get above ground and find out what's really going on, and they become friends. Which is interesting. I like how he describes the novel there. And here's one of the things. Penultimate Truth is not one of my favorite executions of Dick concept, but it is one of my favorite concepts. And it's one that I would love to see adapted into film.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. It's such a great idea. I mean, I guess it would be, you could criticize it that, this idea of a false reality has been done so much in Hollywood, but it's, Dick was there first.
Yeah, he definitely was there first. Well, it's funny, too, because it's the same thing with Time Out of Joint and, what's the Jim Carrey movie with the
Truman Show? Yeah.
Truman Show, yeah. I mean, it's so obvious that that's such a Philip K. Dick concept and that he really did do it in a way more out there in science fiction way with Time Out of Joint. But, yeah, The Penultimate Truth has been, a lot has been taken from it. But I think both The Defenders on its own and Penultimate Truth both make excellent adaptations.
But I like how they get to different places, because the Defenders, you get to, there's a good reason for what the robots are doing, and you could argue, whatever, the morality of it, but there seems to be a benevolence at the end, like a benevolent goal of reclaiming the earth and creating a new man that's beyond war. In the Penultimate Truth, it's all just to create a feudal barons, essentially. That's what they become, right? They have their serfs, these robots that are being made by the people below. It's this brutal class structure. I mean, even the urban planning of it. I actually wrote a little essay for Philip Dick fan magazine about urban planning and the Penultimate Truth. That you have like the gated communities and the slums and the working class underground. There's like an urban geography in this book that's fairly well articulated, I think. Speaking of, it's not so much world building as much as really there's an urban geography that's quite alive here.
And I think some of the descriptions of the surface and the whole the way that the way the lie is constructed is really some of the best writing in the book. I like on
the description of the buildings, the Ozymandian structures. I mean, they're not even feudal lords; they're beyond that at some point, almost like emperors.
Yeah, and like, okay, on page 12, I love this writing right here. Yep, he nodded. It was so. 2 weeks. Death by destruction of the red blood cell making capacity of the bone marrow. 1 week. The bag plague or the stink or shrink of the raw claw paw. And he already felt germophobic. Already, a few minutes ago, he had quaked from the trauma of it. It's great. This book, to me, it seems on the surface, because it's a fix-up novel, it's really easy to kind of just push it aside as another one of his pulpy fix-up books. But I think it's in the top 5 of political novels for Dick.
I can see.
Yeah, because I think when we on our episode about it, we discussed that it probably is the most political of his first 15 years or first 10 years, and even more so than Man in the High Castle. Like that was one of the things that I think at one point Anthony tried to argue with me that Man in the High Castle was more political, and I would say that Penultimate Truth is definitely the most political. I mean, they're all political.
Yeah, it's. I don't know if I'd go to say it's the most political, but it's one of the most political, and it has a nice overlap with Martian Time Slip, even though they seem to have been written a couple years apart. About again developers, I think you do have this urban geography with the slums, the gated communities, the people underground, very separate classes, right? Because you got the elite, the Yantsmen living in Ozymandian structures. Houses, pyramids, whatever. Then you have these populations of people who left the underground living in kind of like these ghettos, right? Often in hot spots. I remember they were often put in places that are still radioactive. And then you have the working class all shoved underground. But then you have this whole time travel plot on top of it, which is also about development. It's just like in Martian Time Slip, time travel being used to promote a real estate scheme.
Yeah, we didn't like that storyline. I think that was the thing we all agreed on, is that we all thought that was kind of random. Well, no, it was not the time travel, but the alien part of the storyline.
The alien artifact and the rights to the land and the Cherokee, right?
Yeah.
The Cherokee time traveler. Really it does seem not to fit into the rest of the story, but it's on its own, it's great stuff. It's I agree, it's kind of crammed in. But I love Unreconstructed M so much too, that that method of assassination is so clever, especially when people big data.
The Killer TV. Yeah, the Killer TV is great. And
then I forget if it's in the novel or the short story, but how they collect data and they use big data to catch the criminal, and then how that whole system can be used to frame someone. It's great.
I think it's in both.
Yeah,
I like a lot of the action with the Lettys, and I think the way that the warlords control them is some of the interesting and funny parts. I do actually, since we're talking about the Killer TV, I do have that page number written down where it happens, so maybe we can get to the bottom of. Let's see. If there's anything about the collection of data, but a portable television set is not an instrument by which human death can be. Do you want to take over the job, Foot said, of finding your Lord's Slayer? Or will you leave it to me? And then later on the end of the chapter, he says, a precog hunch, it's going to take days or even weeks to get at what works within this TV set. So I do think it was hearing, and then he says, here in his hands, he had the death instrument, but a hell of a lot of good it was going to do him. So I do think it was collecting data on him. I think that's what it's trying to say in that scene.
But I think, I don't think there was that much in the story, expanding the Defenders a little bit. It's still, he had to add this whole Lantano plot with the time traveler and the alien device and I like this in part because of that great scene where the bulldozing, the land gets bulldozed. I just think it's so. I wonder if Dick just drove by a site being cleared for development and thought of this. Somewhere in California, he saw that and he thought this would be a great scene to put in some kind of future novel. That he, a novel set in the future. So I love that. But yeah, I just think there's not that. It's a good political novel, but once the point's made, he had to kind of stretch it out into a story. So you end up with these cobbled together stuff with the with Lontano and his whole plot to bring down the Ants-Men and all that.
Mm-hmm. And again, I don't know why he keeps having Cheyenne being like this refuge or this place where the government goes after the end of the world, but for some reason Cheyenne is. And then he says,
I guess that's where he thinks the bunkers are or something after the war.
Yeah, the Cheyenne hotspot cooled down enough in 10 years, 15 years, and then someone grabbed it ahead of me, Montano said. So it's kind of funny that he was like, oh, damn, I didn't buy that Cheyenne property when I had the chance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Penultimate Truth, I think it's good. It's an interesting back-to-back with the Simulacra that he did both of those in 1 year because they have some similar themes. But before we get to the Simulacra, let's just kind of wrap up our thoughts on the Penultimate Truth. I think for a fix-up novel, if you never knew that it was a fix-up novel, you might be like, where the hell is all these weird... I mean, we just... For the listeners... Evan and I were both just on a podcast. We just recorded a podcast for the SFF audio podcast about the World of Null A, which was written by Amy von Vogt. And Vogt was Dick's biggest influence growing up. He's been reading them. He was reading them when he was 16 years old, particularly that novel, which he heavily riffed off of to make Solar Lottery. But one of the things we learned by reading The World of Null A was that von Vogt, if you think convoluted, out of nowhere, weird plots happen in PKD novels, von Vogt was 1,000 times worse. And so when you read a novel like The Penultimate Truth, it may seem like it's really all over the place, but it's really very well plotted compared to von Vogt.
All these things come together and in the story.
Yeah, they do come together in here, but I think better than some novels. But
we could talk about the Simulacrum. Yeah, that's a glorious mess.
That is a glorious mess, and what a segue, Evan! Whoa. So,
was
any
that the
last
story?
thoughts? Any last thoughts? To ruin the segue.
It's always been close to my heart just because it deals with urban issues. It's got an urban geography I love. It's dealing with development. And I think one of the key issues in our time is democracy in cities and, how we kind of develop the right to the city. And Dick doesn't talk in those terms. He's not overtly politicizing the city the way he is politicizing truth in the media here, but it's there, and I'm glad he's there. I think there's a lot more that could be written and said about Dick's urban geography, and I think this is a key novel in that mission.
Yeah, and so Penultimate Truth has a special place in my heart too because it's post-apocalyptic-ish, sort of in the lie. It is, anyways. And I think The Defenders is one of my favorite short stories from that era.
Oh, one more thing about this. Have you guys read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein?
I've read articles from it, but I've never read the whole book yet.
The idea there is basically during a disaster, earthquake, or hurricane, a coup d'etat, capital usually uses these to come into places where, to push neoliberalism, essentially. So capital is able to take advantage of crises. I mean, that is kind of what's happening in the Penultimate Truth too, right? You have this war, and then it just becomes, after, an excuse to accumulate wealth in the form of these levies.
Yeah, in our episode of the Penultimate Truth, I compared this to Chomsky in saying that it's like manufacturing consent with robots.
Yeah. Anyway, Simulacra. That's next.
Yeah, so the Simulacra was written... Yeah, let's go to the Simulacra. Simulacra was written in March to August 1963, which is pretty long time for Dick. That's a long writing process. And it was written after Game Players of Titan and before Now Wait for Last Year. So it was published in 1964, and it cost 40 cents to buy. And for 40 cents, you got 56 named characters. For us, that was one of the things about the book was just like...
I think there's like more plots than chapters in this book.
Yeah. The Simulacra is definitely not one of my favorites. Let's just say that up at the front. I enjoy our episode about it because we had Cody Goodfellow in the studio with us, and he always makes things funny. But it was written in the summer of 1963, and his title was... Again, terrible. The First Lady of Earth was his title. Simulacra is a better title. Thank you, Don Wollheim.
Mm-hmm.
And it is an expansion of the novelette Novelty Act, which PKD had written in March 63. So he went immediately from selling the short story into expanding the concept. Usually these fix-ups are 10 years later, but this was like back-to-back. And let's see, in August and October, Dick had corresponded with Terry Carr, who was an editor at Ace. And on 3 occasions, and those letters are all about the Simulacra. And it was funny because one of the things that amused us about it is that he basically said he didn't remember what it was about after a couple months. Like, he was just like, I don't even remember what's going on.
Well,
and then
I think it's hard to actually say what this book's about.
Yeah, and he said, even
because you say, okay, it's an extension of Novelty Act, but there's not that plot of people performing to get invited to perform for the First Lady and this role of pop culture. It's part of the novel, but it's a pretty small part.
Yeah, and so it's weird because he didn't like it at the time, but then years later he went on to say, I like the Simulacra. It's a very fine book in some ways. It's incredibly complex and has an incredible number of characters. No shit. Well, and let's see. Yeah, I think he does talk a lot. We do have a lot of notes about the things he said about it. And at the Metz conference in France, he commented on it during his lecture. He said, in a sense, I'm learning about the novel not from English prose models, but from French prose novels. So it makes sense, perhaps, that my writings would be well received in France. A novel of mine, such as The Simulacra, for example, which contains 15 or 16 major characters, is definitely derived from French writers like... is it Balzac? Or it's not Balzac, is it?
I don't know.
It is Balzac? Okay.
Balzac?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My wife
famous
just
though, right?
Mm-hmm. He actually speaks French, so... but, yeah. So that's the background that we have on the writing and publication history of the Simulacra. General opening thoughts, Evan, on the Simulacra.
Okay, so if you were to take try to write down the plots, I just did that. Write down the themes and the plots of this novel. So, class-structured society, the bees and the geese. So we got like a genetic kind of division of society. Dick does this a lot, but you got that. You got the whole political structure. Nicole, the actor, being the center of political power. The rotating husband being the one who's elected, right? That's really interesting and kind of cool and very cynical view of politics, but I rather like it. Plus, you got this serial monogamy theme, which he played with in Game Players of Titan and many other of his novels. He's got this really wonderful sexual politics we can talk about. We got neo-fascism here, and we got a neo-fascist coup. We have time travel related to this neo-fascist coup. We have a psychic piano player.
He's my favorite.
We have mental illness and psychiatrists being banned. We have Martian colonization, or with Looney Lukes. We have Neanderthal survivals that come to repopulate parts of the world. We have the role of popular culture for, get your jalopy. We got popular culture being a tool of political control through the whole performing for Nicole. We have a technocracy. I guess that's the bees and the geese thing again. Wow. I mean, there's more plots than there are like chapters in this book.
My two favorite.
And I kind of love it. It's just wonderful. What a mess it is. I don't think it's one of his great novels. I just think there's so much going on. And it's very little of this is based on other short stories. It'd be more explicable if he had written all these ideas in other short stories and merged them together. But he didn't. Most of these show up for the first time here.
Well,
I guess Kraken Space has Neanderthals. You got the jalopies and other works too, but basically it's all just here. He's not borrowing clearly from other short stories except Novelty Act.
Well, it's funny because some of his, like, with Three Stigmata, because it's so weird, I think people just generally assume that he was blitzed when he wrote that, and that he was just, like, kind of out of his mind, like, spinning, like, 1,000 plates. But The Simulacra is the book where I think he was completely blitzed writing this thing. Yeah. Because the Jug Band alone, which is...
Oh, yeah.
Jug Band that goes to the Con App, like...
Yeah, just getting the old band back together and they were playing jugs, that's beautiful.
Yeah. The telekinetic musician, the jalopy salesman, the Ganymede living recorders, the way that the traffic works, the time travel, the paranoia, and there's...
Well, this one has all the advertising too, right?
Yes, where...
Like the psychic advertising or something? They're using
psychic advertising, and we talked about that in our episode, that it was like... Yeah. The way the psychic advertising worked is that the way we describe, or Cody described it, is it's like if you walked by a box of Cocoa Pebbles, and then suddenly this psychic message makes you not only think that you want to eat Cocoa Pebbles, but that Cocoa Pebbles are literally chasing you. You know?
Yeah.
And so these psychic, these psychic messages and advertisements are literally hounding you at a psychic level is one of the best things in this novel. And that's the thing is,
I think he kind of did he pioneer the Google ad? I mean, was there anyone before him who basically predicted the Google ad or the Facebook ads, the targeted ads? Because there's a story back in the 50s he wrote that, what's it called? Sales Pitch, I think it is, where he's getting the constant ads on his commute home from work, and it's kind of like, is your wife unsatisfied in bed? Or are you experiencing too much flatulence? They're clearly Google ads or the, Facebook ads. Tracking your internet history to craft the ad particularly for you.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I think Simulacra has all kinds of amazing little interesting details, but as a novel, me personally, it doesn't work.
It doesn't. It's a mess. How much did I say about this one? 5 episodes.
We don't have to go too far. I mean, there might be Simulacra heads out there who are going to be like, "Man, they shortchanged the Simulacra. I wanted 15 minutes on the jet band." But if they want,
I have over an hour on it on my podcast, so you can listen to all I have to say. I appreciate this novel just for its craziness.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And a lot of these, like, when I'm in it and I'm trying to break down the novel and I'm thinking so much about it, it's one thing. But then looking back, when I'm looking at my notes and I'm like, oh, yeah, that was hilarious. Oh, yeah, that was really funny. And I think with the Simulacra, the humor in it, This is the one that, like, if you were to adapt this into another medium, you would want a comedy director, I think. There's somebody who does, like, really weird, surreal stuff, like a Terry Gilliam type, to do this kind of story. But, because that's kind of the tone that I get when I think of the Simulacra. But
I would like to see this sort of adapted and pretty much a page-for-page adaptation. But I mean, if I was a billionaire, I would put my money behind like a Clans of the Alphane Moon. Totally politically incorrect.
Genius
adaptation of Clans of the Alphane Moon.
Wow! So the Clans of the Alphane Moon was the next Philip K. Dick book, and the Clans of the Alphane Moon was written in December 1963 to January 1964. So he wrote this one lightning fast, right after Zapgun and before Kraken Space. And Clans of the Alphane Moon is one of the rare ones where we actually end up with Philip K. Dick's chosen title. And I think he had a short story called Shell Game that had some of the elements of it. But
Shell Game, which one was that?
I don't know. It's just I had a note to myself to look up the story Shell Game, but I never did. So
once I see the plot, I'll remember it.
Yeah, not sure.
I'll look it up.
But Clans of the Alphane Moon was actually completed.
Oh, I remember Shell Game. Shell Game's the one where you have the soldiers who think they're under siege or something.
Okay, I don't know what
they think they're being attacked by aliens, but they're actually just mental patients.
Okay.
A group of paranoid mental patients long stranded on an alien planet, believe themselves under attack by aliens or Terrans. But they're actually just nuts. They're just crazy people. So that idea of the paranoids carries over.
Yeah. So Phil K. Dick said, and I quote, "I love Clans of the Alphane Moon because the entire thing works up to this one funny scene where they call off the attack on the rocket ship and the robot hasn't been told, and he goes down and hammers on the door." And then the interviewer says, "I really love that book too for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the scene near the end where the relations among all the characters get so complex that the main character has to just sit down for 3 pages and try to untangle who's on whose side. And he finally realizes that it's an impossible equation to solve." And then Dick says, "That's a funny book in many ways." And so, yeah, that was a...
it's one of my favorite of his.
Yeah, it's a friend of the show and serious dickhead, Cody Goodfellow. It's Clans of the Alphane Moon is his second favorite Dick book after Three Stigmata. And I know he was a really big fan of it. And I know there was a controversy. Yeah, it's okay. So... for some reason, Barry Malzberg's afterward really pissed people off, and I know a lot of fans were really upset that for some reason they thought Malzberg didn't understand anything about Dick's life, because I think Malzberg was commenting on Dick's personal battles with mental health as it related to the writing of this book, although we go into more detail on that in our episode about Clans of the Alphane Moon, but I don't remember the details with that quite as much. But for me, I don't like Clans of the Alphane Moon as much as you do, and Cody and Anthony and all the people in our circle, because for me personally, I think Clans is an amazing idea, and I like the idea, and I know it's totally politically incorrect, the depiction of mental health. That's not my problem with it. It's a book of its time. My problem with the book is that I think it focuses on the wrong main character. I think instead of the husband going through the divorce, Chuck Rittersdorf, I think it should be his wife, Dr. Rittersdorf, should be the main character. because I think that makes more sense for us to see the society on the Alphane moon from her perspective. Would make more sense to me. But
yeah, I could see that argument, especially because she has more of an arc as a character, kind of this realization that she's like in the clan. She should be in one of the clans, more so than Chuck. Like Chuck ends up in the normals, right, or the tribe. So
which
doesn't have that.
Yeah, and then you get into this is where the book where you first start to see, Anne being depicted in their divorce in the novel, and boy, I hope she was reading his work, and that's one of the reasons why I think their marriage ended, because she was starting to see how she was depicted in these books, and this is the first of the kind of series of books where the wives are just basically painted with horns on throughout throughout these.
Well, I'm so interested in anything he has to say about family and relationships and sex. So it's I don't mind that stuff so much, but I can see. I mean, that's why I think I would like an adaptation of Clans of the Alphane Moon, but it would have to be totally politically incorrect, so it can never be made.
Yeah. Well, I actually talked a lot about how I would adapt Clans of the Alphane Moon on our episode, and the main thing I would do is switch the characters, and then Larry got really mad at me because he said that's not even the same book, and I understand that, but I said I would, if I adapted it, it wouldn't be totally faithful, but I would stick with the other stuff, because I think it is a really bananas idea, and one of the things I like about Clans of the Alphane Moon is just how fucking crazy it is. It's, when we start to talk about, Philip K. Dick is a weird writer, this is a really great example of a just totally bizarro idea.
I want to say something about mental illness.
Sure, go.
I actually did some research on this when I wrote about Philip Dick, is the discourse on mental illness in the 60s. Some of the big heads were really pushing social explanations for mental illness, right? So I guess I forgot which book I saw this in, but the idea was, people, they saw this, people witnessed this, people went to World War II normal, and they came out, I guess the word at the time was shell-shocked, right? Essentially having PTSD, right? So they passed their psych check, and then something happened to them in the war, right? And psychologists who started looking at these started coming to the realization that there are social, cultural contexts to mental illness, right? And so the most extreme position in this was, his name was Thomas Sands, something like that. And he said mental illness is essentially a myth. It's all socially constructed. And you have, of course, Irving Goffman with Asylums, his book, which really criticized the asylum as an institution, and on and on. So this is in the air at the time, mental illness being sort of a social disorder, or that we're all, if we're all basically essentially mentally ill because we live in a sick society. And that's what I find so interesting about Clans of the Alphane Moon, is you have a functioning society. It's just they're being honest about that they're all crazy, I guess.
Sorry, the dog is behind me.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you can hear that. Can you hear that, Larry?
Nope.
No.
Okay, good. All right. So, yeah.
Anyway, that's my rant about mental illness in this book. I think this is really of its time in this social analysis of mental illness. Right?
Well,
this idea that essentially we're all mentally ill.
Yeah, there's some really hilariously great science fiction in here with Ganymedean slime. I mean, Lord Running.
Oh, that's
hilarious.
Or even that woman who can go back in time 2 minutes to save lives. She's on call at the police department.
Right. Yeah. So I like all the weird stuff in this book, and I definitely think this is an era where he's just letting it fly with the weird gonzo stuff. And I definitely appreciate that. And I'm not going to relitigate Larry and I's argument about Clans of the Alphane Moon because he and I got into it pretty intensely in our episode. But I definitely, for me, it was just the structure. I just thought this novel had the wrong main first character, and but I like the concept, and I think it's a weird and funny one, and it's a good twist if you don't read what the book's about before you start reading it. When you realize what's happening in a chapter or two in, it's a really cool reveal. So yeah, I like Clans of the Alphane Moon.
I think I know why he makes Chuck the main character though, because he just wants to focus on the piling on the misery of this character during this divorce.
Yeah,
that's really the story he wants to tell. Is just how miserable how horrible Mary is to him, and how she just piles everything on, right? Making him get a job, right? That you need a job to pay for my my life, even though I have a job, and then he's got living in this horrible apartment with slime mold. And it's kind of beautiful.
Yeah, I do think it's one of the weirder, more interesting ones that he's got there. I do like. That a lot of the book is kind of a setup, and I do think that he did kind of plan it all along, and I think that's good. And I don't have a ton to say about Clans of the Alphane Moon. I think that the mental illness stuff is definitely of its time and interesting, and I'm sure if you're paranoid schizophrenic, maybe the name, the Skitzes and the Pollys and the Heaves and all that, maybe that would annoy you if you had one of these mental issues. But I think it's licensed.
I guess it couldn't be written today, obviously.
No, but I do think we talked in our episode about hey, what's our diagnosis? Which clan am I going to be in? And we had a lot of fun with that.
But I think there's something actually kind of radical and a bit progressive about his portrayal, even though he's got this language that might be suspicious, Adolfville or whatever for the who's an Adolfville, the paranoids.
Yeah,
there's problems here, but the core idea is all of these people with these mental illnesses have a duty, have a role, have a function, have something to contribute to society. Mm-hmm. They don't need to be institutionalized. That's part of the point, that they can self-govern. They have, every of these groups has something to contribute.
This is a good one if you're trying to explain to someone who's never heard of Philip K. Dick outside of the movies, if they're want to know about, what's one of his weirdest books? And concepts. This is a good one to say, so there's this planet, and it's basically a big mental institution, and all these clans are run by the people with these different diagnoses, and it's their. Hold on a second. We have one more book to go.
Where else is in this novel? Oh, he started taking the job writing late night comedy sketches. I remember that too.
Yeah.
His job was writing Cold War propaganda, but then
he's writing late night comedy for the CIA.
Yeah.
Which is one of the hilarious things about this book. And I do think Clans of the Alphane Moon is funny and weird, and so it has a place, However, his weirdest book, could be said to be the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. It's definitely, in our opinion, one of his masterpieces. The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch was written after Crack in Space and before Penultimate Truth. So it's funny to me because I think Three Stigmata is operating on a level that's way above either of those books. Well, I don't know. But when I think of the pantheon of Philip K. Dick novels that are at his highest level, I think of ones like Man in the High Castle, Time on a Joint, Hide in the Sky, and the Three Stigmata. And I think one of the things about Three Stigmata is that I think it's tightly plotted, and all the problems that we've been seeing in some of the other books with stuff being like completely left field is not here. And as weird as the book is, if you understand what it's trying to say, it makes perfect sense, and it's very well plotted. But it's a book that you might have to read a second time. But the first time I read it, I liked it, but I wasn't entirely certain everything that was happening. And when I read it for the second time for the podcast, then it's like Mulholland Drive. The first time I saw Mulholland Drive, I had no idea what was going on. And then the second time I watched it, I felt stupid for having not figured it out the first time. And I kind of had that feeling with Three Stigmata, which actually is a short story fix-up as well. It's a fix-up of the Days of Perky Pat, in the sense of just some of the concepts from the Days of Perky Pat, and the whole idea of Perky Pat gets moved over, but it's a very different short story.
Yeah, I think it's like with the Penultimate Truth being a mashup. The themes and what he steals from it are so differently applied here. Like, first of all, it's post-apocalyptic, the Days of Perky Pat. It's not on Mars. They don't use drugs in Days of Perky Pat. I mean, that is more just a really horrifying concept, the Days of Perky Pat. That after this war, the adults, all they can do is play Barbie dolls. That's the only thing they're capable of doing, is living in this past. Here, it's a much more communal experience. There's something actually kind of... There's a Gestalt experience. If you think, go ahead to like Galactic Pothead.
Well, I have a quote,
which I think is his best novel, which is all about this Gestalt experience and project. And here, it's used through this drug experience. And I think it's fascinating what he does in this story. And...
Yeah. So I have a quote here from Dick about Perky Pat. He said, "In those days in the early 60s, I wrote a great deal, and some of my best stories and novels emanated from that period. My wife won't let me work in the house, so I rented..." Oh, this is about both, I think. "So I rented this little shack for $15 a month and walked over to it each morning. This was out in the country, and all I saw in my walk to the shack were a few cows in their pastures, and my own flock of sheep, who never did anything but trudge along after the bell sheep. I was terribly lonely, shut up by myself in my shack all day. Maybe I missed Barbie, who was back at the big house with the children, so perhaps Days of Perky Pat is a wishful fantasy on my part. I would have loved to see Barbie or Perky Pat or Connie and companion show up at the door of my shack." So, that's interesting. And
I've heard that story before.
Yeah, and Dick, definitely, this book was inspired by his hovel. He wrote the hovel for a couple years, and I think Game Player's the Titan. He tells the story about like the big angry mechanical god watching him walk to the hovel, which I'm sure was him just telling a story to be funny. But many articles posit that he really believed he was being seen by this mechanical god. I think he was just fucking with people. But this was nominated by his peers for the Nebula Award for Best Novel in 1964. And I have another quote from Dick. This is great. We love this one on our episode. "I wasn't able to register my car for 65, and the Highway Patrol gave me 2 citations, which, if I can't pay, as well as registering my car and fixing the muffler, I'm going to be jailed on April 7th. But I can't see borrowing anymore, even though the advance from you..." This is a letter to his British publisher for Three Stigmata. "Even though the advance from you is down now to $750. What I'm holding out for is the Jonathan Cape money from the UK. Oh, no, this is to the literary agency. Do you think it'll be coming soon? I think good news about that would really cheer me up." So he was really down on his luck at this time when he wrote this book. And that's very clear from the tone of it. And, Yeah, there's a lot of quotes about his LSD experience. Our episode about Three Stigmata, we had J. David Osborne on, to the author. He's the author and publisher, and he's way more knowledgeable about LSD than me, since I'm a person that I don't do drugs. So he had a lot more to say about the experience of it. But one of the things he definitely, I think Dick has made clear, is that he wasn't super into LSD. He only used it a few times, according to him. But this is definitely inspired by a bad trip. I mean, this book is the ultimate bad trip novel. And so there's all kinds of elements with Mars and with the Perky Pat and the isolation and the hovel. But in addition to that, it's the bad trip. I have one other quote I wanted to read from Dick, and then we can just get into it, is he said, "In my novel, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which is a study of absolute evil, the protagonist, after his encounter with Eldritch, returns to Earth and dictates a memo. This little section appears ahead of the text of the novel. It is the novel, actually. This paragraph, the rest is sort of a post-mortem, rather, a flashback in which all that came to produce the one paragraph book is presented. 75,000 words, which I labored many months over, merely explains that it is merely to provide background for that one small statement." Which is kind of an interesting thing. He's basically saying you don't really, it's all about that first paragraph. Which is a really interesting thing for him to say about Three Stigmata. But for me, Three Stigmata is also a horror novel. And I think Dick kind of touches on horror from time to time in his oeuvre, but I think Three Stigmata is every bit as much of a horror novel as it is a science fiction novel. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I like it. I think this is one of the. Let me think if there's some other cases that fit. I mean, there's always terrific things going on, but this one has that almost Lovecraftian kind of cosmic horror. Almost gets to that level.
It does. And I think with the two drugs, the Choosy and once Choosy gets involved, and the way Choosy affects you is it gets in your mind and it controls you, and it changes your perception of reality and everything. And then once that happens in the book, it's just it's that's when it gets cosmic and crazy. And I think also one thing that's really interesting is because cli-fi has become a term lately, the climate change fiction. And we talked about this in the episode too, is recently someone said to me, "Well, it's too bad that wouldn't it be, and I always said this too, is like, wouldn't it be interesting to see what Philip K. Dick did with climate change?" But Three Stigmata is a cli-fi novel. It is about a fast warming Earth. And, people feel like, they get drafted to Mars, they have to go to Mars, and if they go, it's harsh there too, so in order to survive, you have to take these drugs, and you're not going to survive if you don't take the drugs. So there's interesting things with the frontier there. But to me, this is one of Dick's most perfect novels. This is his weirdest and most successful science fiction novel to me, but it also works as a horror novel, and it's just a hallucinogenic nightmare from beginning to end, and it's a book that takes multiple readings to fully understand what's going on, and once you do, it's so good.
I agree. I probably read it 4 times, and I did the closest, deepest reading when I did my podcast series on it. How many episodes was that?
I think 5.
Yeah, I was breaking up most of these novels into 5 at that time. Sometimes I did a one-off. Yeah, 5. No, 4.
Okay.
I did 4 on that one. But yeah, especially the end. I think it really takes multiple readings to. I mean, it's. You know what? It's. Ubik has this feel that you're in one novel for half of it, and then you're kind of in another novel in the second half. But the second half of Ubik is not nearly as wild and difficult to grasp as this, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think
like the first half stuff though. I appreciate the first half stuff maybe more than others. I think a lot of people like the wildness, the hallucinogenic qualities, the drug trip half of it. I like the precogs jumping into bed together because they know they're gonna anyways, and I love the use of precognition to predict fashions. I mean, in the Campbellian sense, where you got these superhuman figures who are going to change everything and bring humanity to another level. By this point in Dick's career, he's just saying, like, these superhumans are going to work for some corporation selling Barbie dolls or layouts, right? They're selling layouts for the Perky Pat or for the candy use. And it just becomes so mundane.
But I think
the frontier stuff. And I love the candy experience. I think I'm kind of with, who is it? Is it Bolero? Who says, like, candy is a superior experience? I think so, because it is this gestalt, which I think that's something I think Dick is really longing for. Maybe it's being in the hovel. He's maybe kind of lonely in the hovel at this point, so he kind of seeks this gestalt.
Well,
I think quite a lot about it.
I think the mundane parts of the first half are essential because you have to understand the depth for which people are looking for escape in order to take this drug, Choosy, that will you never escape from. And it's not like a drug where you take it once and then you're addicted and you crave and you desire it. It never wears off. It's just you're in once you start. And I think one of the things that I think Dick was playing with the idea of addiction, and one of the funny things is that it's unbelievable to me, and I think Dick was surprised when he heard that people thought that this was a pro-drug book, because it's absolutely not. It's an absolute nightmare of what a drug can do to you. And so the experience, from my understanding, because I am straight edge, so I don't know, is that usually with a lot of times with bad trips that people can feel a loss of time, which Dick plays with again in with the LSD dart. Yeah, and now in JJ 180 and now Wait for Last Year and the LSD dart in Lies Incorporated. But specifically in Lies Incorporated, or in the Lies Incorporated, the expansion of Unteleported Man, the concept of time being irrelevant. But this is the key for how this demonic figure gets, worms into your mind. So I think, it's interesting that Dick was playing not only with addiction to chemicals, but addiction to the concept of God and religion, which, he saw himself as a religious person, but at the time, and we're really into the whole Gnostic thing. So I think on a certain level, Three Stigmata might be one of his deepest books as far as themes and concepts. It's certainly my favorite, But I don't know. I mean, I could go on all day about like the horror aspects of Three Stigmata, because as somebody who writes science fiction and horror, I really appreciate that he at no time ever blended those two things together quite as well as he did Three Stigmata. It's just, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. And I will tell you, Three Stigmata, our episode has way more downloads than it does any other episode, because I think so many people love this novel for what it's done. But Three Stigmata, where do you place it in the oeuvre? Because most of us, I think it was definitely the one that got the most #1 votes on our panel of Dickheads. So
I don't think I put it as #1, did I?
No, you didn't, but a lot of us did.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason this is important is the three stigmata themselves. These keep coming back in his career and his writing. You know, alienation. What's the other two? I forgot them.
Oh, the actual three stigmata.
Yeah, they're thematically essential to so many of his work. I forgot.
Well, another thing too about this book.
Should have written that down. I don't want to alienation.
I can talk if you want to look it up, but one of the things I like about this book is that it is pulpy sci-fi. It does have parts that are just incredibly well written. It does have parts that are political, and it's weird as shit. I think this is the most firing on all cylinders, that because even like some of his higher class books like Martian Time Slip and Time on a Joint and Man in the High Castle, like Man in the High Castle can come off as a little stuffy and boring for some people, not for me, but I know. But this one has everything. It has everything that people could want.
Oh, and I see it here. I put it as number 2.
Yeah.
I found my voting. Martian Time Slip was 1, Three Stigmata 2.
You do love those Martian.
Fans of the Elfane Moon 4, Penultimate Truth 6. So most of these are in my top 7 or 8.
Yep. Well,
Simulacrum 7.
So let's wrap up Three Stigmata, and then we're done for tonight.
All right.
But I mean, overall, do you think? Because you obviously with number 2, you obviously think highly of it, but I think one of the things that's interesting is that this is the one that I found the most quotes from Dick talking about it. And it's funny because when we
like
first
from the
started
exegesis, did he? Did he mention it a lot in the exegesis?
I believe he does. And in fact, I have this quote here. He says, "In the beginning of my scene, that I could see the sun, see God at all, and the sun showed that I was not entirely blind, but rather deranged. My 374 experience are an outgrowth of my Palmer Aldridge experience over 10 years earlier." Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that does come from the exegesis, I believe. And then, he definitely did talk about it. He saw it as a route towards the Gnostic stuff that became obviously a bigger deal in Valis. So, it's incredibly important. I don't want to shortchange it here. I know we're ready to be done. ready to be done, but you did 4 episodes on it, and we did an over 2-hour long episode with J. David Osborne, so there's plenty of material out there on Three Stigmata. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing that, I think the combination of the drugs, the horror elements, the cosmic horror elements, the pulp sci-fi, the frontier, and the political commentary makes it just a perfect combination of PKD at its strongest.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of his best.
Yeah. All right, then.
Lots of fun. All right, yeah.
But
2 hours. You said we were going to do 2 hours. Yes.
Yeah, we weren't gonna do 2 hours. We did 2 hours. Damn it. All right, so people can find us on other on our own podcast, and can you tell people more about your podcast now?
My podcast. Well, I did Philip K. Dick read through. It's the podcast is the main podcast is where I read through the Library of America, 100 pages at a time. So that's the name of the podcast. I'm currently working on Francis Parkman Jr., U.S. historian. But a couple years ago, I did a complete read-through of Philip Dick, including all the stories and novels. I didn't get to the mainstream posthumously published stuff yet. I have to go back and do that. And currently, I'm working on a read-through of Lovecraft as well.
Yes.
So if you're interested in Lovecraft or Philip Dick, or just American literature in general, you should come check out my podcast.
Well, that's funny because a couple days ago, whoever was smart enough to get at H.P. Lovecraft on Twitter, follows Dickheads, and it was great to see that our Betsy Woolheim interview got liked by H.P. Lovecraft. I liked the idea that H.P. Lovecraft was scrolling through Twitter and was like, "Oh yeah, I want to listen to that Betsy Woolheim interview." He does get mentioned in there, so. But I really appreciate you doing Lovecraft. I'm going to dive into that here soon, and really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem.
We will get back with you quicker next time to do the next 5 because we're almost done with those 2.
All right. That'll be Lies Inc., Zap Gun, that stuff. Dr. Blood Money?
Dr. Blood Money is the next one after this one, and then I don't remember the order, but we'll get there. But we're doing
Zap Gun has drugs too. Another drug book.
Zap Gun.
Crack in Space.
Crack in Space. Yep. There'll be Dr. Blood Money, Crack in Space, Now Wait for Last Year, and Unteleported Man. I think it will be.
Still in this wild period. I love this era.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't like the late stuff that much. To be honest.
Yeah, we're definitely in the best period. So, Evan, thank you for joining the Dickheads podcast.
Yeah,
and
thanks for having me.
I'll probably see you on SFF Audio again at some point, and it was great talking to you. All right, later, Dickheads.
Yeah, thanks, you guys.